Welcome to the 9th event and last event of Democracy Matters, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ran Abramitsky, a professor of economics here at Stanford and the Senior Associate Dean for the Social Sciences. Over the last 9 weeks, I hosted 38 Stanford faculty with the goals of showcasing some of the incredible talent we have around here at Stanford, as well as bringing the community together to talk about social challenges like democracy and COVID, the economy and inequality, racial injustice, polarization, immigration, healthcare, and the elections. I was reminded why I love Stanford so much. It is the strong commitment to do good in the world, and it is the people. The faculty, so inspiring, so knowledgeable, so creative, and doing such amazing scholarship. The students, bright, engaged, listening critically, and asking challenging questions, and the staff members, helpful, dedicated, and working so hard behind the scenes to make us all look good. Today, I have an all-star lineup of 4 amazing colleagues who will talk about big topics, some of the deep, long-term challenges our society is facing for the next decade. Walter Scheidel, professor of classics and history, will tackle the question of whether the pandemic will remake society. Fei-Fei Li, professor of computer science and co-director of Stanford's HAI Institute, will discuss the future of human-centered AI. I asked Gretchen Daily, professor of biology and the director of the Center for Conservation Biology, to talk about how to stop environmental destruction, and Stephen Chu, professor of physics, Nobel laureate, and former Secretary of Energy, will speak about what the world needs to become carbon neutral. As always, each speaker will give a 10 minutes presentation, and we will follow with a discussion and questions from the audience. Just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen anytime during the event, and we will answer as many of your questions as time permits at the end of the presentations. Okay, so our first speaker today is Walter Scheidel. Walter is the Dickerson Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Classics and History at Stanford. Walter's research ranges from ancient and pre-modern social and economic history to world history of inequality, state formation, and human welfare. Walter is really a prolific scholar. He is the author of 20 books and about 250 articles. His most recent award-winning books are Escape from Rome, The Failure of Empire and the Road to Prosperity, The Science of Roman History, Biology, Climate, and the Future of the Past, and The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. Now, Walter has also written widely for the New York Times, Financial Times, Atlantic, The Economist, Le Monde, and other media outlets. He has launched a number of international research initiatives, including the interactive website Orbis, the Stanford Geospatial Network model of the Roman world, which has received over 1 million visits and attracted global media coverage. Walter has received many awards for his research, including a New Directions Fellowship by the Mellon Foundation and a Guggenheim Fellowship. So welcome, Walter. It is really great to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much, Ram. So my job is to talk about whether the pandemic is going to remake society. And the short answer is no, it's not actually going to do that. But since I have 10 minutes, I'll talk a bit about why I think this is not going to happen. Now, when COVID started earlier this year, there was a whole flood of publications in the media with pundits trying to outdo one another, predicting all kinds of radical changes that would happen as a result of this pandemic, which has by now died down a bit. And that's probably a good thing, because it's important to be precise. The question is not, is the epidemic going to have any kind of long-term consequences? Because that's pretty certain that it does. The real question is, will those effects lead to a change of direction, really remaking society in a meaningful sense? And that's far less obvious. There are certainly plenty of ways in which COVID has reinforced, amplified, accelerated existing trends, changes, shifts, and developments, and will continue to do so. There are any number of things that were already underway before the pandemic started, and they are now being amplified by this event. Nationalism, populism, anti-globalist sentiment had already been quite common. International indices of freedom weren't doing also well. Economic inequality had already risen to very high levels. Corporate debt had already reached record highs. Central banks had begun to play a bigger role in driving the economy. There were already mounting tensions between the US and China. Oil prices were already too low to sustain the petrostates, especially in the Middle East. The European establishment was already keen on funding green innovation. Digital tracking, surveillance have become ever more invasive. Online shopping had long undermined the retail sector. Remote instruction, telecommuting had been expanding for a long time. Millennials, we know, had been dealt lousy cards by the Great Recession 12 years ago, by austerity measures. African Americans had always led short and unhealthier lives well before the pandemic struck them disproportionately badly. And even the so-called novel coronavirus isn't really that novel if you think of the SARS and MERS outbreaks over the last 20 years. So I could go on and make an even longer list, but I think the underlying point is pretty clear. In lots of ways, COVID reinforces existing trends, but doesn't reroute trajectories of change. And that's what would be required to lead to an actual remaking of anything. Now, I suspect that Ran asked me to contribute to this series because a few years ago, I wrote a big book about how only very massive disasters had reduced economic inequality across time, like the fall of the Roman Empire, the two world wars, or the communist revolutions. The Black Death in the late Middle Ages was one of those forces. The bubonic plague killed so many people in Europe in particular that labor became scarce, workers could charge higher wages, pay lower rent for land that they would lease. And so for a while, the poor were less poor and the rich were less rich. And established authorities were undermined, secular and religious authorities, because they couldn't do anything about the plague and people noticed. None of this is going to happen as a result of COVID. COVID is not going to be an equalizer. We already know this. We know that inequality, if anything, has been going up even further rather than down in the US, in other countries. This is partly because of job losses have disproportionately hit the young, low-income groups, less skilled segments of the population, and traditionally disadvantaged groups. And those economic inequalities have been replicated in other domains. If you think of worse health outcomes for the most exposed members of our society, if you think of inferior learning opportunities and outcomes for lower income students who are struggling to log on and have good internet access and all the rest of it. Meanwhile, the rich have recovered with really astonishing speed. If you look at Bloomberg's index of multi-billionaire fortunes in the US, you see a very V-shaped recovery that took less than 3 months. That recovery has been tracked very closely by the S&P 500. And that's very good news for everybody who has a portfolio. It's good news even for Stanford and Stanford's endowment. It's not good news for anybody else. So why has COVID not been more disruptive? The most straightforward answer is that in the end, COVID is not nearly bad enough to be truly disruptive. Not that many people have died or are going to die as far as we can tell. And here we really need a comparative perspective. If you go back in time 100 years, you look at what is wrongly called the Spanish flu, the great influenza pandemic of 1918-19. Back then, about a little over 0.5% of all Americans died. In today's population numbers, this would be close to 2 million fatalities in the US alone. And most of those who died were in their 20s and 30s, leaving behind widowed spouses, orphaned children, a great deal of disruption. Worldwide, about 2% of humankind perished 100 years ago. In today's numbers, this would be about 150 million fatalities. That's 100 times the current documented death toll from COVID. And even though that pandemic was much more severe than what we're experiencing now, it didn't really change all that much, if anything, on its own. So what does it take for a pandemic to bring about truly transformative change? Well, in the late Middle Ages, 1 out of 3 people died in Europe and probably also in China. So if you want disruptive transformation driven by plague, that's what you have to look for. And luckily, we are nowhere near in that kind of situation. Now you might ask, what about indirect consequences of the pandemic, social, economic, political consequences that certainly exist, but they're being blunted by mechanisms that didn't exist in the past. I'll limit myself just to 4 of them. The first one is social welfare. Even 100 years ago, during the influenza pandemic, many Americans had a simple choice to make: go to work and face the flu, or go hungry. That's to some extent, it's still the case today, but not to the same extent. Our safety net is often being criticized as being quite rudimentary compared to that of other high-income countries, but it certainly protects many millions of households from more extreme forms of immiseration and thereby prevents larger societal destabilization. The second factor is quantitative easing. As long as central banks in alliance with governments are able to keep the economy afloat by creating trillions of dollars or euros out of nowhere, there is no urgent need for radical reform, for strongly redistributive taxation, for instance, unlike what we saw during the New Deal in the 1930s. That in turn makes radical change quite unlikely. Third factor is technology. We're all sitting here, obviously looking at our screens, participating in a Zoom session. Zoom as a business was only set up 9 years ago. The people who make the most money right now mostly work from home. Even 20 years ago, this would not yet have been possible. And the fourth mechanism is, of course, science. Never before in history has the science response to a crisis like this been as vast and as rapid. 100 years ago, people didn't even know that the flu was caused by a virus. They didn't know that there was such a thing as DNA and what it looked like. This time, the genome of the virus was sequenced and published within a few weeks of the initial outbreak in Wuhan. And it's now easy to lose count of all the many vaccines and treatments that are being developed. Now, if you put all these various mechanisms together, the prospects for some version of the status quo persisting are actually very good, and the prospects for transformative change are extremely slim, to put it mildly. Now, you might think that maybe living through this kind of crisis would engender higher degrees of social solidarity. And that's certainly something that happened during the world wars, especially World War II. And we had some war rhetoric early on that we're in a war against the virus and we all have to stick together. But in fact, the pandemic is the exact opposite of mass mobilization warfare. Modern war brings people together and we are told to distance. War usually increases trust, cohesion within the group as it fights another group. We have come to distrust other people because we are worried they might be infectious. War rips people out of their familiar environments and brings them together in new ones in the military or in factories. We are told to stay home and stay put and keep to the people closest to us. Now, last week, for those of you who watched the lecture a week ago, Frank Fukuyama talked about how exogenous shocks might rebalance American politics, but he also noted that no recent shock has been strong enough to do that. And I believe the exact same thing is true for COVID for all the reasons that I have just given. So if the world is going to be remade by any kind of shock, it would have to be a much worse shock than COVID-19, like MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, that killed 1 person out of 3 infected, coupled with the same rate of dissemination as COVID. That would be really dramatic and might in fact happen one day if we are unlucky. But if that doesn't happen, we'll just have to wait for the more drawn out effects of climate change, for instance, to really shake things up. But 2020, we can already tell, is not going to be the great game changer. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Walter. This was such an insightful presentation. And our next speaker is Fei-Fei Li. Fei-Fei is the Sequoia Professor in the Computer Science Department at Stanford and co-director, together with Stanford's former provost, John Etchemendy, of the sensational Stanford's Human-Centered AI Institute. Fei-Fei has published hundreds of scientific articles in top-tier journals like Nature and PNAS. Her current research interests include cognitively inspired AI, machine learning, deep learning, computer vision, and healthcare. She is the inventor of ImageNet, a critical large-scale data set and benchmarking effort that has contributed to the latest developments in deep learning and AI. Fei is an elected member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Medicine. She was also vice president at Google and served as chief scientist of AI and machine learning at Google Cloud. And she has received way too many awards to be mentioning in a short introduction. Beyond her many technical contributions, I have to say that one thing that I really admire about Fei is that she's a national leading voice for advocating diversity in STEM and AI. She is co-founder and chairperson of the national nonprofit AI for All, aimed at increasing inclusion and diversity in AI education. So welcome, Fei, and thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you, Ran, and everybody for the invitation. And it's hard to follow Walter, who gave such a riveting presentation. So I'm here to share with everybody what we do at the Stanford Human Centered AI Institute, but even more importantly, why, as a technologist of AI for the past 20 years, I believe it's that time of human history that we open a new chapter of AI and technical work in a human-centered framework. As I said, that I entered the field of AI 20 years ago, actually as a physics student. We have a physics Nobel laureate here on the panel, so I feel embarrassed to say that. But it was just a personal curiosity, intellectual curiosity of how to make thinking machines and how to discover the secret, the mystery of human intelligence. But little did I know that fast forward 20 years later, in the second decade of 21st century, AI as a whole has become an extremely powerful technology that is leading the transformation of almost all industries. And it is impacting human lives in very concrete and profound ways. Even as we speak, we look at every aspect of our life, right? How we shop, how we read news, how we get information through our social media, how we in the background of our daily lives, how financial decisions are made, how sometimes our judicial systems are working, and how medicine is advancing and impacting patient lives. All of these are now more and more involving AI technology. This realization really drove home when I was at Google, and I was chief scientist at Google Cloud, speaking to so many different companies and hoping to build products and services that help these companies to transform their business. And because of that, I realized the social changes by this technology is profound. And just like any technology that humanity has ever invented, it's a double-edged sword. We're at this cusp of an inflection point of how we massively take advantage and unleash the potential of AI, yet also harness and forecast and guide its potential adversarial impact and put guardrails. So that's where Human Centered AI Institute was the point of inception in around early 2018 under the encouragement of Stanford leadership from President Tessir Levine, Provost Percy Strel, and also especially John H. Mindy, who was the former provost of Stanford, joined the leadership of HAI, and we launched in 2019. So what do we do and what do we believe in this institute? Well, we are built upon three intellectual ideas that we think are key elements of what human-centered AI means in our work and also in how we impact the rest of the world. the first element of human-centered AI and HAI's work is to recognize that this is a new chapter of AI. It's no longer a niche computer science discipline. It's actually by nature deeply interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. The social aspect, the humanities aspect of AI is just as critical. We need to invite thought leaders, researchers of social sciences such as economics, political sciences, sociology, as well as legal scholars, ethicists, philosophers, to come and join us in understanding what AI's impact and forecast its course, its future course. So at Stanford, we have leading economists who are working on AI and future of work. We actually just launched Stanford Digital Economy Lab, headed by Professor Eric Brynjolfsson, and also Professor Susan Nath is a world leading scholar in the studies of AI technology and future of work. We also work with philosophers and ethicists to look at different aspects of machine learning bias, privacy issues. We also aspire to work with we also work with Friedman-Spogli Institute, Hoover, as well as CEPR on policy, and especially wanting to provide the kind of thought leadership to guide future policies in AI. So that's the first intellectual pillar, which is recognizing that we need to study, forecast, and guide AI and understand its human societal impact. The second part of our intellectual founding principle is that we focus on a verb. If you talk about the word AI, the first verb a lot of the public think about is replace. AI is to replace humans, including doctors and so on. But we deeply believe AI is here to enhance and augment humans. The opportunity of augmentation is far more important than replacing humans. Of course, AI can take humans out of harm's way when it comes to disaster relief and rescue. But in many, many sectors, whether it's healthcare or education or farming, agriculture, and many industries, AI has an opportunity to enhance. And this is a topic even dear and near to my own heart in healthcare, where we find our doctors and nurses completely overworked, especially in a pandemic and also beyond. And many times our patients and individuals not receiving adequate care, thinking about aging population and seniors living at home. And AI as a technology can be an extra pair of eyes, can be a guardian angel, can be an assistant to our caretakers, our clinicians, and ultimately help our patients. And the same thing can be true in education, transportation, and many other areas. And we have leaders here at Stanford, from design school to computer science department to education school, medical school, school of sustainability, and many other places that can work are working on this. Last but not least, the intellectual foundational principle of HAI is that if we were to realize all these goals, especially the high ambition for AI to help people, we need to recognize this is still a nascent technology. As powerful as deep learning has made strides of progress, there's just so much brittleness and also naivety in this technology. Any of you with a child and looking at their child development, you'll be in awe of how a 40-watt brain can learn and develop in such rapid speed and with the level of dexterity, flexibility, depth, abstraction, and reasoning and creativity that none of today's AI can achieve. So leveraging on Stanford's incredible neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science community, we focus on the next generation AI AI technology that is inspired by human intelligence and human brain. And we invest heavily in the collaboration with these institutes and centers and hope to see the fruition of the next generation AI technology. So these are the three founding principles, and we work on both education, research, and policy front to enable and empower our researchers to create courses that are cross and multidisciplinary, and also to educate the public by hosting business executive courses, congressional staffer courses, journalist and media courses to communicate AI. And last but not the least, we invest heavily in working with policymakers to enable a national and international dialogue of how to advance AI technology, but making sure it serves the human purposes and is human-centered. So I know my time is up, but I'm happy to answer more questions. And one last sentence I want to say is HAI is really honored that we're working with more than 300 faculty and many, many students across all 7 schools of Stanford. And we continue to welcome the kind of building of this community and everybody's leadership in this.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you so much, Feifei, for this inspiring presentation, really. So thanks a lot. And next we have Gretchen Daily. Gretchen is a Bing Professor of Environmental Science at Stanford's Department of Biology and the Director of the Center for Conservation Biology. Her research is on the future dynamics of biodiversity change, on quantifying the production and value of ecosystem services across landscapes, and on new policy and finance mechanisms for integrating conservation and human development in major decision-making. Her work spans scientific research, teaching, public education, and working with leaders to advance practical approaches to environmental challenges. Gretchen co-founded the Natural Capital Project, an international effort focused on achieving this integration through research, practical tools, and policy-oriented demonstrations in various places around the world. She works extensively with private landowners, economists, lawyers, business people, and government agencies to incorporate environmental issues into business practice and public policy. Gretchen is a member of the US National Academy of Sciences. She has published hundreds of articles, and her most recent books are The New Economy of Nature, The Quest to Make Conservation Profitable, with journalist Catherine Ellison, and Natural Capital, Theory and Practice of Mapping Ecosystem Services, co-edited with several of her colleagues. So welcome, Gretchen, and thanks a lot for joining us today.
Hello, everybody. I'm really grateful for the chance to be here. I appreciate this whole series actually bringing our community together around incredibly challenging topics and thinking about not only kind of our responsibility, but also our agency and the tremendous opportunity we have from our platform here at Stanford to contribute to solutions. So I'm going to dive into a really big topic that Ram gave me. I'll try sharing my screen so we can enjoy a few images in thinking about basically a whole new approach that, as Walter said, is one of many things that got going before the pandemic, but where I hope that the pandemic marks a moment in this whole year of the terrible fires and smoke and other tragic impacts of flooding, continuing and accelerating deforestation and other assaults on the planet, that this year and the pandemic mark a time to rethink in many ways, you know, the pandemic being a direct consequence of how we treat nature, to rethink how we treat nature and to get to the root causes of environmental destruction. We need basically to stop seeing nature as a cost or an expenditure and to move our idea of nature into the asset and income category of our brains and of how we manage financially and in practice. So I'm going to lay out a natural capital approach that's been developed over at least a couple of decades through many leaders here at Stanford and across the world, and just get us all thinking and talking about this. And I look forward to engaging in the conversation toward the end and afterward if you want to get in touch. So, you know, we need to start thinking about nature as an engine of prosperity, as basically elements, a type of capital stock, elements of our assets, our financial, physical, human, our knowledge and skills, our social capital, our other types of assets around which we've got much longer periods of institutional development and implementation to help secure those other types of foundational sort of ingredients to human well-being that supply over time a stream of benefits. So how can we start thinking about nature this way, and what is natural capital? We're talking about Earth's lands, waters, and biodiversity. And, you know, what does this boil down to? In any given place, it boils down to, rather than clearing nature, lands, waters, and biodiversity, and extracting from it, thinking about investing in and actually regenerating the nature we need to support the still rapidly growing human population and still rapidly growing impacts on the planet. So we can look at this landscape, just take it in for a moment, this rather expansive landscape. What this comes down to is the question of where to draw the lines. We can see these croplands, and we all know the value, whether we, you know, of cropland, whether we're enjoying food or actually work in the farming sector or food sector. We know the value of cropland, and there are a lot of systems in place to secure the values of cropland. But what about the forest? We get tremendous benefits, life support benefits that we couldn't possibly live without for climate and energy security in forests shown here and around the world, water security, physical and mental health, many other types of benefits that we'll get into from the forest. Where do we draw the lines? How much do we protect? How do we secure both the nature and human livelihoods? So far, we've considered kind of the systems to be separate, and yet they're intimately connected. And how can we generate basically a return on investment to private land stewards, landholders, to supply benefits in the short term and privately, and solve that market failure that help secure humanity over the long run? And finally, what new financial systems and metrics do we need to guide the transformation we hopefully are about to make toward green and inclusive development before it's really too late? And how much of the world's biodiversity do we try to bring along with us? Basically, until the next asteroid hits, it's people more than any other force that will dictate how much of life persists beyond basically our century, this couple of generations really working across the world today to get us onto a better path. So if you had coffee for breakfast, and if it was grown in the Americas, you are most likely connected to each of the species here for pollination, for pest control services, and for maintaining the dynamic balance of life support processes and services that come from ecosystems. So how do we think about that? Up until now, this has mostly been the realm of philosophers or ethicists, people in religious domains. But over the past 20 or so years, I can say with exhilaration, despite the worry over the speed of destruction, that the community reaching for this new way of thinking, this opening this new kind of pathway to development, inclusive and green development, has created a whole new approach, a whole system that integrates science for delivering the benefits we need from our life support systems and moves it into practice. So the science is contributed by hundreds, and some of these newer areas to thousands of researchers in each of the areas shown here and many more. And it's being deployed now across most countries, and just starting up with data streams coming in the first cities worldwide. And the idea is to take advantage, as Feifei has touched on, of the incredible data streams coming in, the incredible science, but much more than that, the opportunity to engage and work together with decision makers at every level, not only in boardrooms, but to drive impact, to bring Stanford students out into the world and co-develop understanding and innovation around our waters and lands and around livelihoods, and then make that knowledge accessible through software and through convenings and the many other ways we get together as a university, but make this accessible and actionable. So that INVEST software is now being deployed in many places. And here we just showing a couple of high-level examples. First on the bottom, and I'll get into in more detail, a delegation from China here for 2 weeks from the Department of Development Planning and the Department of Finance. And then here with Belize, a much smaller country, but one that developed, using this approach, a sustainable development plan for 20 years that's now being implemented. How do we scale this up? The other kind of massive challenge before us is, as countries buy into this approach, how do we scale it up? And the major development banks, the Inter-American Development Bank and others, have joined forces to finance plans like that in Belize and to extend the success in places like China to many other countries. So I'll show you just briefly, using that software, China has prioritized for protection and investment these parts of the country, amounting to 49%. And basically every square meter is now zoned with the 49% for protection and regeneration, paying about 200 million people as part of their livelihoods to achieve this restoration for social, economic, and other key dimensions of national security. And finally, on that question of new metrics, China has put forth a metric together with researchers at Stanford and the Natural Capital Project called Gross Ecosystem Product. And I'll just touch on it super briefly. It's alongside GDP and is being used to help guide these investments, taking in data from many different sources, using INVEST to reveal the flow of benefits from the condition and extent of ecosystems across the country, and then informing their contribution to the economy and society, informing financial compensation among regions, and helping to evaluate the performance of policies and leaders meant to implement them. And this is now being taken up across Latin America, with Costa Rica, one of the many leading countries, and basically opening an opportunity we've never had before on the environment front to work with really impactful partners in the development community and increasingly in the boardrooms of private companies and investors, looking at the risks, costs, and utter devastation that is coming from neglecting the environment and seeing it basically as a cost, and looking at the opportunity to get on board and accelerate this transformation to green and inclusive pathways of development. thank you again for the chance to chat with you about this. And handing over now back to Ron and Steve Chu.
Well, Gretchen, thank you so much. This was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And our final speaker is Stephen Chu. Stephen is the William R. Cannon Jr. Professor of Physics and Professor of Molecular and Cellular Physiology in the medical school here at Stanford. He has published hundreds of papers in physics, biophysics, biology, bioimaging, and other energy technologies. At Stanford, he helped launch BioX, a multidisciplinary institute combining the physical and biological sciences with medicine and engineering. Now, Stephen was the 12th US Secretary of Energy from 2009 to 2013. As the first scientist to hold a cabinet position and the longest serving energy secretary, he recruited outstanding scientists and engineers into the Department of Energy. He began several initiatives, including Advanced Research Projects Agency, Energy, and the Energy Innovation Hubs, and he was personally tasked by President Obama to assist BP in stopping the Deepwater Horizon oil leak. Stephen is also the co-recipient of the 1997 Nobel Prize in Physics for his contributions to laser cooling and atom trapping. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Welcome, Stephen. It's great to have you.
Fine. All right. So I was assigned to talk about what the world needs to become carbon neutral. I'm going to tell you some good news, but also what else we need. So, but before I do that, I'm going to refer back to a favorite saying of mine, said by a former Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Yamani. And he said, the Stone Age came to an end, not for lack of stones, and the oil age will end not for lack of oil. And so what did he really mean by that? And what he really meant is that we transitioned to better solutions. So when we went from the Stone Age to Metal Ages, it was better technology. And the unsaid thing is, if there isn't a better technology, a better solution, we'll continue to use the old solutions. And so if you consider the trillions of dollars of oil and natural gas under the ground in many countries, if you don't get a better solution, it's likely that will come out of the ground. All right, so the good news is that renewable energy, especially wind and solar, is plunging in price. These are the prices of wind and solar. Each little circle is a specific contract. And this black line is the estimated cost of electricity produced by natural gas. And what we see here is by 2019, 2018, the cost of solar and wind is actually declining below natural gas. This is great news. Let's talk about something else, batteries and batteries for electric vehicles. This is a chart of the energy density per unit weight on the x-axis and energy density per unit volume on the y-axis. And the lithium ion batteries, that red star is the battery used in the Tesla S1 energy density. And I am pretty confident that within 5 to at most 10 years, we'll be somewhere up here. In addition to that, over the last 10 years, batteries have declined tenfold in cost, and they're going to decline another 2 or 3-fold. And finally, a very visible target, which I think will be achieved, is we can get a battery within a decade where in 5 or 6 minutes, you can charge 2/3 of the range of your car. That means you go additional 200 miles in 5 minutes of charging. And at that point, everybody will move over to electric vehicles, but you don't have to have a charger at home. You don't have to have a charger at work. You can go back to a service station. So these are all good things. However, and another good thing is by 2040, an optimistic projection is that 55% of light vehicles sold globally will be battery operated. The bad news is that means 45% will be internal combustion engine cars, and they have another 15 years of life. So it's a very slow transition. Now, let me go to what we really need. With renewable energy getting less and less expensive, people began to say, how much energy storage would we need in order to start to run the world on a large fraction of renewable energy? Because, you know, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. And the answer is roughly, if you want to be at 30% renewable energy, you don't need any energy storage. And that is borne out to be largely true around the world. If you want to go to 80% energy storage, how much do you need? Well, this is energy storage in hours, so that looks pretty good. That's 20, 30 hours, 2 days at most. But it's 2 days of the entire electrical supply, which is thousands of times more than we have today. The other thing about this energy storage is the cost has to be about 10 times less expensive than what EV batteries will achieve in the next 10 years. So the cost has to dramatically decrease. And do we have energy storage with this capacity, chemical energy storage? The answer is no. So here's another thing about energy storage that you should be reminded of. If you look at the energy storage in the world today, this is pumped hydro, thermal storage, electrochemical storage, electromechanical storage. 96% of it is pumped storage. So what is pumped storage? Pumped storage is something very simple. You have an existing dam and you have a little reservoir below, and you let the water go through and it turns a generator and you generate electricity. But you don't let the water flow away from the dam. You have a little holding pond, which could be a few percent of the capacity of this dam. And when you have excess electricity generated, you just run the thing backwards and pump it back up the hill. It turns out that this pump storage is more efficient than today's chemical utility batteries, with all the friction of pumping water up and down the hill. This is what the water turbine looks like. This is what the generator looks like. I just want to impress upon you the size scale of how big these things are. These are people. But nevertheless, this remains the least cost. If you have an existing dam, it is far and away the cheapest cost of storing energy. But not everywhere in the world do we have pumped storage. And so this is the issue. People are beginning to look at the possibility of taking excess electricity, actually putting it into heat, not by just heating it up some reservoir of molten salts, but actually using a turbine to actually transfer the heat in what we call a heat pump. This is unproven technology, but it's something like this is what we need, because the chemical storage, let me remind you, won't be there in the coming 20 years, 30 years. All right, my final talk about what we're going to need is we're going to have to think dramatically about changing our agricultural practice. Right now, about 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agricultural land use and forestry. That's more than the carbon emissions from all of electricity generation in the world. So this has a major impact. And already half of the arable land, habitable land, that's excluding oceans, lakes, mountains, deserts, are used for agriculture and grazing. All right. Now, we have industrialized farming, we in the United States, but all over the world. Here I show you pictures of beef, cattle, pigs, broiler chickens, turkeys. The full circle is the natural lifetime of these animals. And this little red section over here is the time which they're slaughtered. And they're actually slaughtered in a very small fraction of the time. And they've been bred to grow so rapidly and so efficiently that you can do this. For example, the average market weight of a pig after only being alive for 24 weeks is 280 pounds. Growing 280 pounds in 24 weeks. Here's another example. These are domestic turkeys, the kind for Thanksgiving. They're only raised for 3.5 months before slaughter, and they're weighing 15 pounds. But these are very strange animals. They're so breast heavy, they can't even mate. So they're actually reproduced by artificial insemination. This is very industrialized. They look very different than wild turkeys. We don't know how old they are. I can only tell you how old this wild turkey is. It's 8 years old. if it's 101 proof. Now, if beef and dairy cattle were a country, the total carbon emissions from raising them would be equivalent to more carbon emissions than the whole EU 27 plus Great Britain combined. Only one ahead of it would be China and the United States. And so also, we've altered the entire world. 96% of all mammal mass in the world are humans and the animals we eat. All the lions and tigers and bears and rats and everything are only 4%. We need better meat substitutes. We need to actually, Sheikh Yamani somehow got in there. We're going to give a world of 11 billion people. We need something like that. Finally, we need to revolutionize agriculture completely. And that means the fertilizer in plants the plants have to be made to be largely self-fertilizing. This technology is being developed. And the idea of just having another green revolution to restore soil fertility, to put carbon back in the ground and to use less energy is a big challenge, but it's achievable. But it needs some work. And I show you in this last picture an example of this, a company in the Bay Area where they put microbes on the seeds of corn, and the corn and the microbes then enter into a symbiotic relationship, and half the fertilizer is eliminated from the corn. It's a beginning, but we need to go through the entire agricultural chain in order to do this. And so finally, we need the ability to store energy as a liquid. Why? Because you ask how much does it cost to ship crude oil halfway around the world and store it? It turns out it's 2 pennies a gallon. So you're going to make energy where you have a lot of energy, ship it around the world and store it. And we need this. These are some of the crucial elements we need in order to move into a more sustainable economy. And let me finally remind you all, there will be no vaccine for climate change. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. That was really great. And as people are now submitting their questions using the Q&A function, let me maybe start by asking you one question to all of you. And you know, the question has the word optimistic in it, so maybe we go in reverse order so that Walter can think about something too. And the question is like, how optimistic are you about society's ability to address some of the challenges that you identified? So maybe we can start with Stephen.
I'm bipolar, depending on what day or hour. I think because the effects of climate change are becoming very, very apparent, much more shockingly fast than I ever thought 10 years ago, people are beginning to wake up to it, but not with the urgency, just like it's become like mask wearing, it's become politicized. And so how do you get this away from politics and try to convince people that in our best interest, we won't ruin the economy and we can really do this? In fact, I personally think it would be economy booster, but this is some dialogue that in the United States especially, it's very mixed.
Gretchen.
Well, I'm with Stephen, bipolar as well. And I guess I'd say there are a lot of irreversibilities, and they are those kind of inflection points or tipping points have either landed and they're here around us right now, as exemplified by the fires we experienced in California a month ago, or they're, you know, right on the horizon and much closer than I thought we would see at this point. And so what I can say is I tend not to ask myself that question of whether I feel optimistic or not, because it's hard to keep going when having optimism as an expectation. But rather I ask myself about the fulfilling nature of the life we can lead in trying to bring people together around new ways of thinking and new ways of working at a place like a university, how to engage and drive meaningful change with all of the advantages we've been so fortunate to come into as members of this community. There's so much we could do. And I'm inspired by what some other countries are doing. The other day, for example, I was part of a group running a so-called training of Swedish CEOs. And these are CEOs of a lot of big companies that we've all heard of in technology and white goods and food systems, in IKEA and in forests, in investments, a lot of banks and investment companies. We need to engage at that level as well as at the level of understanding deeply how to make this all work with people actually stewarding lands and waters. And we can do much, much more. So that aspiration of doing a lot more and doing it together with our wonderful community and partners around the world keeps me going. Thank you.
Thank you. Feifei.
Yeah, well, so +1 to the bipolar club. But I'm with Gretchen as well. So I don't think about being optimist and pessimist too often, because it's really that sense of responsibility that drives me on a daily basis. It's that this technology, AI, is so powerful and it's so transformative that it is our generation's responsibility to guide it in the right way. And whether see myself as a technologist or a mother or an educator, that sense of responsibility and also maintaining that hope that we can do things is what really drives me. And I think there are evidence of hope, right? So for example, just 5 years ago, when I walk around and talk about AI in its social context, you don't find too many voices around you that share that belief. But today, the multi-stakeholder community of our world has come together. Policymakers are taking interest. Civil society and activists are taking a really important role in this. And then we, even on campus at Stanford, I talk about our 300 plus faculty community, and they literally come from all 7 schools and almost every single department, including our department. And that awareness of shepherding technology into a more human-centered future is becoming a shared goal, and that does keep me, humbled and also hopeful.
Thank you. Nice. And finally, Walter.
Well, I guess now I have to say something optimistic. I guess in a way we have all been victims of our own success, in that modern capitalism has been extraordinarily successful in just transforming life all around the planet, and our form of democracy has been extraordinarily successful in some ways. And so these forms of organization, institution are exceptionally deeply entrenched now, because they actually have delivered the goods over such a long period of time. And so the question is really to what extent the awareness that all my colleagues have referenced will grow enough in order to counterbalance this entrenchment of these previously successful ways of doing things, and become powerful enough to modify, not replace them, but modify them and make it possible to work within these existing forms of institutions, organizations, to bring about actual change. And I tend to agree, it's very much an issue of creating awareness. So I'm agnostic as to whether this is going to happen, but I think there's at least a chance that this might work in the longer term.
Well, great. Thank you so much, all of you. And now let's turn to questions from the audience. And today I want to invite my bright graduate student, Jenna Kowalski. Jenna is a PhD student in the Department of Economics, working with me on higher education and economic mobility in the United States over the last 2 centuries. And Jenna is also interested in studying urban economics from historical perspective. She hopes that by better understanding how and why cities are formed in the way that they did, we can gain insights and tools for fighting present-day urban plights. So thank you very much, Jenna, for joining and for moderating the Q&A today.
Thank you so much, Ron. It has been a pleasure to hear from all of the panelists so far, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing the discussion. And so the first question here is for Professor Scheidel. We have had a lot of political disruption over the last 4 years, with many more Americans engaging in political discourse in new ways. Has public engagement ever resulted in massive societal changes on the levels that you've studied?
Well, there is no short answer to this. I mean, generally, there has always been engagement of large groups of the population. But it's also true that historical change on a grand scale has often relied on sort of triggering events, of sort of ruptures that would destabilize or undermine the established order and make certain kinds of movements suddenly more appealing or successful. If you think of the labor union movement or the expansion of the franchise and having women vote and any number of things, they were tied up with these crisis events. And that's why I think the original question of is COVID going to remake society is a good one, because we should be looking for those kinds of ruptures and crises. But historically speaking, it seems to take more powerful crises to really, as I said, shake things up. So it doesn't mean that social movements are not important or powerful or influential, but that seems to be only one part of the story. And when the person who asked the question said, well, we have seen 4 years of strong engagement, we also had an election just a few weeks ago, that seems to point more in the opposite direction in terms of its overall outcome. So that goes back to my basic point. Apparently what has happened so far has not been sufficiently disruptive.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Professor Lee. Bias in AI is a serious concern, though admittedly one that seems impossible to perfectly avoid. What is HAI's approach to reducing the bias that is built into these increasingly widespread tools?
Great question. I think, machine learning bias or fairness efforts is a big effort, not only at Stanford, but also in the worldwide machine learning and AI community. And just very briefly, I think bias is not a simple term, it's a very nuanced term. In the pipeline of AI systems, bias comes into many different touch points in the pipeline, from data curation to problem formulation to the learning algorithm itself to inference to also how humans eventually digest and uses these decisions or inference results. So HAI, one of the most important characteristic of HAI as an institute and what we're promoting is multidisciplinary approach. We treat AI as a deeply interdisciplinary field. We support work that sees this way. And so just in the machine learning bias or machine learning fairness effort, we've got computer science theorists and mathematicians who is looking at mathematical definitions of robustness and defining bias, working with, say, cardiologists on how to treat long tail data in a more fair way. We've got historians who are gender experts working with computer scientists and medical big data experts, looking at textual documents and see where the problems of gender bias appear and how to algorithmically remedy that. We've got management science researchers working with police report data and using NLP techniques to anonymize potential racial or gender or even neighborhood information that might introduce human decision-making bias. We've got ethicists working with policy scholars and computer scientists that created a course, now one of the most popular undergraduate computer science course, that is talking about the ethics and fairness issues of, and also policy issues of computer science. So I'm just giving you examples of just a few projects. We have a lot more happening at HAI and across Stanford to show you the kind of interdisciplinary work and the different approaches from theoretical mathematics and statistics all the way to, you know, application areas and teaching educational efforts to combat this, this issue.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Professor Daly. How much attention is placed on much attention is placed on climate tipping points? How much hope do you have for improvements in the next decade? To what extent do you believe that we've reached an unstoppable downward spiral?
So this takes us right back to the question before, and I'm going to put it to the side because I feel we gave views on needing to just work with ever more commitment and ever more resources to drive the change we need. And we are seeing that. So I can report in answer to your question, a really good question, that there is very rapid change. And we're just basically in a race of one part of human culture kind of against another older part. And the examples, the older part being kind of growth in the material throughput of the economy and in material metrics of well-being at all cost. And the new part being a view seeing human well-being as intimately connected to the well-being of nature and other organisms and all the systems that we depend on for our life in every dimension. So examples mostly come from leading countries and major development banks, the multilateral development banks that are very much focused on solving public sector types of problems. And I'll say, number one, they're doing a lot to invest in the shift to, measuring the cost of carbon in the atmosphere. Number two, they're doing a lot to, and thereby on the first, to shift away from fossil fuels to green and sustainable energy systems. Number two, they're investing a lot in coastal climate resilience and other types of climate resilience. Whether it'll be enough, it remains the question, but the example I gave of Belize is just one of a country supported by the Inter-American Development Bank that has now developed a plan for the next 20 years that would secure its coastline and protect people and property from sea level rise and the intensifying and more frequent storms that are projected to hit the country. And that was a dramatic achievement. And now the Inter-American Development Bank is trying to scale that approach across all of its member countries that have coastlines. Another arena is in drinking water quality coming from upstream watersheds with a mix of forest and agriculture and other activities. And there too, we're seeing the Inter-American Development Bank and other platforms, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, promoting watershed management where downstream users pay upstream suppliers in a lot of different ways, but to have the capacity and have the reward to invest in restoration of those upland areas to achieve downstream water security. So there are many examples like that, but we need much more uptake in policy generally at national levels than we have today, and we need much more uptake by the private sector. Those are two key frontiers where basically everybody's holding their breath and working hard and hoping for the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Professor Chu. What are the prospects nowadays for fusion reactors to achieve a positive yield?
Okay, so I'll be blunt, not good. I think that there's a slim chance there'll be, it's scientifically we'll achieve it. But in any case, the issue is that the capital cost of a fusion reactor is going to be significantly more than the capital cost of a nuclear reactor. And the capital cost of nuclear reactors today at the $10 billion mark are actually scaring many, many investors away, utility companies. And so if you just triple that, which is what we think it would cost for a fusion reactor. After you figure out all the science and technology, this is going to be very doubtful. So I think we're going to need a mixture of fossil fuel backup with carbon capture and better energy storage. Let me just return a little bit to this question about tipping points. In a certain sense, we've already passed some tipping points. The glaciers in Antarctica have actually begun to run down, and the only way you can reverse that is to actually cool the temperature of the Earth. And the steady state temperature, based on what we know we've already put in the atmosphere, and we're going to exceed 450 parts per million within a decade or two, I think we'll exceed 550 parts per million with greater than 50% chance. And the only hope is actually to get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it back underground. We may have about 100 years to do this before the sea levels rise to what historical records have said will be about 6 to 10 meters higher than today, based on where we are already. And so, so that's another technology that we really need to do. And finally, when you talk about where we are and how bleak it looks and what we really need, many people over the last decade have asked me, don't you think it's too late? To which I answer, if I ever thought it was too late, then I am surrendering all responsibility to help fix the problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we have one last question that I would like to ask to all of the panelists here. It feels in many ways that today's Stanford students are facing unusually challenging times ahead. How would you encourage them to think and prepare for the future? And we can start with Professor Scheidel, if you would like.
That's a very general question, I guess. I think, since you specifically mentioned Stanford students, I think Stanford students should make the most of all the resources that are available on campus to help them plan and prepare for the future, because they all, in many ways, already find themselves in an unusually fortunate and in a way privileged position to do so. And if they can figure out how to do that, then maybe the rest of society will also have a chance in the long term.
Professor Lee?
Yeah, what a question. You know, I suppose part of the harshness that this question refers to is where the current condition is. I spend a lot of time talking to my students in my lab, and one thing I share with them is every generation faces their own unique challenges, and every generation has to develop their own resilience. And America is a very, very resilient country and a very resilient people. And I do think that knowing we are Stanford community, which comes with its privilege, it's our responsibility to be resilient and use this to make the world a bit better, especially in the context of technology. You know, Stanford had taken a leading role in shaping technology, especially computer-related technology, in shaping today's Silicon Valley. And going forward, I hope that sense of resilience, sense of responsibility will take our students to places that that is more compassionate, more socially minded, more globally minded, and more human-centered. And I especially call out to the students who come from diverse walks of life, that you might not think that you were, you know, a hacker kid since 5-year-old, but in fact, our field, the field of technology and AI, really need the kind of diverse voices and understanding of humanity to shape it to the next phase. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for Stanford students of all backgrounds to participate in this.
Professor Daly?
That is a great question and really good answers from Walter and Feifei. I guess I'll add to that something to do with, in addition to building the skills and taking advantage of the many different types of resources here, including our community, something more in the philosophical realm maybe, of developing a practice of mindfulness. And there are many dimensions of that, but kind of a way of centering oneself daily so that we can remain well-oriented around living a life that we will look back on as having been a meaningful life, even if it's a tough life and things often might not, as Feifei says, in any generation, things normally don't go to plan. But developing a practice for that orientation, that focus, that openness to rethink one's position and acquire kind of new knowledge and new perspective. We need ever more to be open and connect with others and to cultivate the kind of the bravery or the courage that has to come with that. And finally, in all of this, kind of to keep well, sort of to be engaged in this practice with oneself and also with others to maintain kind of supportive communities that, like Feifei is saying, enable us to work together, understand one another, reach across many different types of divides, and be brave in thinking up and trying to drive change, thinking up new ways of doing things and engaging the possibly very kind of different types of people in different places and in the world and different places in society to achieve change. So anyway, more on that kind of practice in addition to acquiring kind of the intellectual rigor and skills needed to then apply oneself in life. Thank you.
And last but not least, Professor Chu.
Well, I always consider Stanford students as being incredibly lucky and in some ways privileged to have the opportunity of this great education. And I find that the large fraction of them, most of them, feel a social responsibility beyond their immediate friends and family and own welfare. Whether you're a humanist, a social scientist, an engineer, or a scientist, I think there's so many opportunities that students have to make the world a better place. And it's very important that one consider that as a goal in your life, so that when you are old and gray, you can look back and say, I'm proud of what I spent my time doing. The COVID pandemic is a very fast-moving version of climate change. It shows several things, that we're interconnected in the world, and what happens in one part of the world reaches the other part of the world. And to me, that this idea that one could really isolate yourself, quarantine yourself from the rest of the world in terms of things like climate change are just impossible. And there will be another pandemic, but there'll be another potential pandemic. I think we will have learned a lot so that it won't reach the proportions that it's reached today. But if I think of all the other things, the racial injustice we face, all of these other things, I think I would encourage the students to think hard about what you can do in any way you think your talents lie to be part of the solutions we will need in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, and what great questions and great answers. And thank you, Walter and Feifei and Gretchen and Stephen, for your fabulous and inspiring presentations. And thank you very much, Jenna, for doing such a great job in moderating the Q&A. Now, this was the last event, so I want to thank the many faculty members who participated in Democracy Matters. I thank them for taking the time and for their inspiring presentations. I also want to thank Deborah Satz, Dean of HNS, for her great support and for moderating so beautifully the important event on racial injustice. I'm also grateful to all my graduate students who moderated the Q&A so skillfully. And it is important for me to take a moment to thank the wonderful staff members who worked behind the scenes to make this event series possible. So I thank Fawn Martz for editing and transcribing the videos and for making them accessible to everyone. I thank Sandra Feder for her support with communication. And I thank Stephanie, Bailey, Rodrigo, Ken, and the IT team for taking care of the technical aspects of the webinar. I especially would like to thank Joy Layton, Ellie Fishbacher Maldonado, and Natalie Jabbar for their endless dedication and their great support. The staff members are the special glue that holds everything together here at Stanford. And finally, I want to thank all of you for showing up every week at the Democracy Matters series, and thank you all for joining. And let's continue to bring the Stanford community together around our core mission to advance knowledge, to prepare students to think broadly and deeply, and to use Stanford's leadership in research and education to contribute to a better world. Thank you.